There's one video that was on my list for the 2,000 subscriber stream that I never got around to watching. Never got around to watching it. It was a video about the German NSDAP. The National Socialists. Which I don't really know a whole lot about. I know basic overview stuff about them. But I thought it would be interesting. I thought this video would be interesting because it has an interesting title. National Socialism Was Socialism. Rethinking World War II History. That's kind of a heretical belief, isn't it? Although, it depends on who you ask. If you're talking to a Republican, then yeah, of course, National Socialism was socialism because they want to associate socialism with Hitler. But I'm not really sure what the take of this particular channel is. I'm not sure. Is this a right-wing channel? Because usually history channels are not right-wing. Usually they're scholarly. And, you know, the truth is not right-wing. It's not exactly left-wing either. It's usually somewhere in the middle. Yes, we're talking about Nazis. I prefer not to call them Nazis because, well, it's kind of, from what I understand, it was kind of originally a more pejorative thing to call. It's like calling Japanese people Japs, you know? Like, you can call them that as a nickname, and maybe it'll be mildly offensive. But I kind of, I'm not, here's the thing, like, I'm not against offending them. I just think that, like, it's not the term I want to use in regular speech when I'm just referring to them. I don't want to always have to be using a term that was kind of invented to make fun of them, you know? It's Nazi is a little bit pithy, but it's also just not a word that sits right in my mouth, like Nazi. That's why I say Nazi instead of Nazi. I don't like Nazi is even harder to say. It like puts my mouth in a weird position. Not Nazi. I don't like it. Yahtzee, that's easier to say. Like the board game. It's not even a board game. It's a dice game with little cards. So yeah, I usually just call them NSDAP, or if I'm referring to their ideology, I usually just call it Hitlerism, because National Socialism more broadly is not necessarily the same thing as Hitler's specific variety of National Socialism, which is a common misconception. And the thing about the NSDAP is that it became Hitler's party. Hitler named it the NSDAP. It was just the DAP originally. It was the German Workers' Party. But once it became the NSDAP, it still had a certain amount of diversity in it as far as opinion went. But after the Night of the Long Knives, pretty much, it just became about Hitler and what Hitler wanted to do and his goals and interests and whatnot. And you pretty much had to agree with Hitler or you weren't going to be in the party. And so I just call that Hitlerism at that point. The ideology of Hitler is Hitlerism. And that's a word that we use. That's an academic term that exists. So I see no reason not to use it. So if I'm referring to the ideology, I'd just say Hitlerism. If I'm referring to the people, I'll call them the NSDAP or the German National Socialists. Usually I won't call them Nazis, although sometimes I will. Anyway, I just think this. I'm just curious what this video is going to be.
What is National Socialism? National Socialism. National Communism. Whoa, wait a second, what? Yeah, let me explain. According to Marxists, modern society is capitalist, and communism is the goal. Socialism is what happens on the way to communism. Yes, I'm being super simple here, but you get the basic gist. For Hitler, socialism was the goal rather than the transition period. So, yeah, Hitler is actually moving towards communism. I'm just going to let that sink in for a second. And in reality, the Soviets never...
Yeah, I mean, sure, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about Hitler's ideology. But one thing I do know is that he really hated communism. And that ill will did extend toward regular socialism, too. That actually makes a lot of sense. What makes sense? I'm curious.
Reached true communism. So they were socialist as well. So when you look at the history of the Second World War and the Axis-Soviet front, you have to realise that this is two separate socialist states going at each other. And this seems to be one of the biggest and most fundamental misunderstandings people have about the Second World War. They think it's a far-right versus far-left war. But is this really the case? Well, actually no. It's actually quite difficult to tell the difference between National Socialism and Soviet Socialism because they're both socialist states with authoritarian leaders. And this is, in fact, a historical debate. Were these two states the same or not? And, well, this isn't as crazy as it sounds when you realise that Marxist socialism is but one variant of socialism because socialism is a spectrum in itself. Hitler was as much a socialist as Marx. They both shared the same ultimate goal, the socialization.
I disagree, though, with the premise that Hitler being a socialist would mean he's not far right. What you were saying before you started the video? Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to view it, personally. But anyway, yeah, I would disagree with the premise that Hitler being a socialist means he's not far right. I think those two things can be true at once. I think you can be a socialist and far right because right versus left, it's not a linear spectrum. And so many people try to oversimplify it and make it into that. You can be far right in one sense and far left in another sense. And that doesn't make you a centrist. It doesn't make you some sort of moderate. It just means you're an extremist in different ways.
Of the people into a harmonious community free of exploitation, but they differed significantly in the methods required to achieve it. The origins of National Socialism lie in the pre-Hitler German Workers' Party. People like Rudolf Jung, Karl Hahrer, and Anton Drexler defined what National Socialism was. Hitler wasn't the guy who invented it, he just sold it to the masses. The Munich version of the German Workers' Party was founded on the 5th of January 1919 by Drexler and Hahrer. Even at this point, the name of the party was up for debate. Drexler argued that the word socialist would show solidarity with the working class and keep ties with the other German National Socialist parties in other states. On the other hand, Hahrer argued that the word socialist shouldn't be part of the title because, by not having it in the title, this would reduce middle-class hostility towards the party. And without the word socialist in the title, they could present the case that they were advocating social welfare rather than social equality. But the reality was they were doing the latter. Once Hitler became the leader on the 24th of February 1920, the German Workers' Party was renamed. It became the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Yes, the word socialist was added back into the title by Hitler himself. The new Nazi flag, the black swastika in the white circle inside a red field, was created by him as well.
This is what we just covered. We just talked about this.
Socialist flag with a white nationalist flag and a pro-Aryan anti-Semitic flag inside.
And the three colors, red, white, and black, were also the colors on the German Empire flag. So he wanted to make a connection between the Third Reich and the Second Reich by using those three colors, because the color of the Republic flag is the same as we have in modern Germany today. It's the red, black, and yellow. The yellow, I think, was more drawn out of the old Holy Roman Empire days, the First Reich. But Hitler was not a fan of the yellow. He wanted to bring back the white. He thought it was more striking and better looking.
As well. But this was both socialist, nationalist, and racist. We National Socialists regard our flag as being the embodiment of our party program. The red expressed the social thought underlying the movement, white the national thought, and the swastika signified the mission allotted to us, the struggle for the victory of Aryan mankind, and at the same time the triumph of the ideal of creative work, which is in itself and always will be anti-Semitic. Also, on the same night that the party was refounded came the 25 Points, the only published National Socialist German Workers' Party manifesto. Points 1 to 3 demand national unity for all Germans, points 4 to 8 were directed against the Jews and recent immigrants, and points 9 to 21, almost half of the points, were socialist in content. These aim to bring about social welfare, nationalisation of the industry, and land reforms, and so on. Hitler had his hand in all of these points. When Hitler came to power, the government got rid of trade unions, but replaced them with the German Labour Front, a state-owned body which promoted cleaner working environments, better canteen food, factory renovations, and social security for the unemployed. This was socialism. Similarly, the party's Strength Through Joy, or KDF policy, saw state-subsidised holidays for all social classes. Cruises, activities, and excursions all were popular with the people. And this is the point. When you hear people say that the Nazis did good things prior to the war, they're talking about these socialist policies. Why? Because this was a redistribution of wealth which benefits the working class. Hitler wanted an economy that could control without owning, thereby removing the need to...
If it didn't have all of the racism and genocide and ultra-conservative social engineering, you know, the far-right stuff, it would be pretty cool, wouldn't it?
Annihilate the entrepreneurial classes within a civil war, as the Bolsheviks had done. He regarded Marx and Lenin as having the right outcomes in mind, but had gone about the project in the wrong way. When the Munich Putsch failed in November of 1923, the National Socialist German Workers' Party basically disappeared. Hitler then wrote Mein Kampf inside Landsberg prison. And did you know that Mein Kampf is a bestseller in the United States? On the Kindle. Just wanted to point that out. But it's also available online for free, so everyone can get a copy of this book and take a look, assuming you haven't got a copy already. But my question to all of you who have a copy of this book, have you actually read it? And did these guys...
I've only read the first part of it. I read up until... he starts becoming anti-Semitic, and then I just kind of... I don't know, I kind of got bored. What the thing is, I don't think he did a particularly good job in that book, from the stuff I read, of explaining his transition into anti-Semitism, because that was actually one thing I was looking forward to reading about. Was I wanted to hear his perspective on that, like what actually convinced him. And it was really weird because in Vienna he was this kid who was just having a hard time. Just, he didn't have a home, didn't have any family. He was really a young man who was down on his luck, and I think a lot of people who get into white supremacism are in that. Stephen Mystery says, LMAO, what I miss? I sing a couple songs, and we're watching a video that it was actually on this playlist for me to review on my 2,000 subscriber live stream, but I didn't get around to it. It's about Hitler. The thing is, he actually kind of lived a life that I think a lot of white supremacists live, where he was just down on his luck in hard times, didn't have anyone in his life to fall back on. And so he needed guidance. And initially he got interested in politics, and initially he joined the Social Democratic Party in Vienna. And he was exposed to a lot of anti-Semitism at the time, but he didn't get it, and he didn't agree with it. And so he would have conversations with people where he would actually say, well, what exactly is it that's so bad about the Jews? They seem like all right people to me. And he would try to convince people to abandon anti-Semitism. But then the turning point that he wrote about was he was walking through Vienna one day, and this Jew walked past him, and he just smelled horrible. And something in that experience triggered this reaction in Hitler. And he's very honest about it. Like, he admits that this weird, illogical thing is what got him interested in anti-Semitism. It's embarrassing that he admits that. But he does, and he doesn't see anything wrong about it. It's very strange when you're reading it and you're like, what? Why would he write this? It reads so stupid. But apparently it didn't seem that way to him when he was writing it. And then he gets into anti-Semitism, and he starts reading about it and learning about it. But he doesn't really, in that book, he doesn't really explain what exactly were the arguments that convinced him, from what I remember. Now, maybe he explains that later in the book, I don't know. But I just remember I got to that point, and I was trying to read it, keep reading it, and I just found myself losing all sympathy for this guy, because he was like, now I hate Jews. And then I changed my mind and started hating Jews. Blah, 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 blah. But there wasn't any real story behind that, other than he ran into one who smelled bad. So I would like to read the rest of the book. I'd like to read it again someday, and I hope that he explains himself better. It's weird because, I was listening to that guy Cultured Thug, who's the fascist on YouTube, who advocates for non-white supremacist fascism. But he used to be a white nationalist. And it's strange, he still has like a weird kind of anti-Semitism and respect for Hitler, even though he doesn't identify as a white nationalist anymore. It's kind of weird. I think that there's more to that guy than meets the eye. I think he might be kind of lying in some way. I'm not sure, because I listened to an interview he did on this white supremacist podcast where he was agreeing with everything the guy was saying, and he was saying a bunch of racist stuff. So, like, I don't get why he's claiming he's not a white nationalist anymore when he seems to be totally cool with that stuff still. But anyway, I was listening to him talking on that podcast, and they were like, anyone who's actually read Mein Kampf knows that, like, Hitler is nothing like the way he's portrayed. And I'm sitting there like, okay, I didn't read the whole book, but like I read enough to see that Hitler was exactly the way he's portrayed. Like, what am I missing? Maybe it was something else in the book that I was missing, but like the stuff that I read was like, yep, that's the Hitler we all know and love. At least he admits his racism is completely irrational. Well, he doesn't admit it's irrational, but the story he tells is just clearly irrational, and so it's very strange. I've met a lot of fascists who reject white nationalism. It's an interesting rebrand. Well, yeah, a rebrand, it's kind of a rebrand, but it's also kind of not, because I think that fascism from the beginning was not about race. But yeah, I mean, there was that whole subreddit, Fascism Reclaimed, that died a few months back, but it was an anti-racist subreddit.
Actually read it as well. The answer is probably no. Why? Because it's terrible. And I'm not just talking about the racism and whatnot, which is just awful. I'm talking about the writing itself. It rambles on and on, going over the same point several times, and it's probably one of the worst written books of all time. It's like a cross between...
Wow. I'm kind of glad he said that, because I was kind of feeling the same way, which is why I put the book down. It's just like, God, like, I know Hitler's a smart guy, but like, if you could fucking write a little bit better, I might be able to understand your position a little bit more, you know? And it frustrated me because I was just listening to those white nationalists talk, and they were like, yeah, Mein Kampf, great book. I read it when I was in prison. It changed my life. Hitler's nothing like he's portrayed. And it's like, what are you talking about? What did you see that I didn't see? Jesus.
Shakespeare, Dickens, and Tolkien. The gibberish.
Oh, I got one chapter into Mein Kampf, and I couldn't force myself to keep going. It was so poorly written, he couldn't stay on one topic for more than a paragraph. Yeah, I don't remember that, but I do remember not being able to get through it. I got through Mussolini's autobiography just fine, but Hitler's... I don't know, man. And it sucks because Hitler actually has a really interesting story to tell. But I guess he just wasn't a great writer.
Just goes on and on, talking about the same stuff over and over that's not important and leaves the reader wondering why they bothered reading in the first place. But I'll come back to the rambling later. The point I want to bring up now is the definition of National Socialism by Hitler himself, which he finds throughout the book. So, don your monocles and prepare to read from the Führer. The readiness to sacrifice one's personal work and, if necessary, even one's life for others shows its most highly developed form in the Aryan race. The greatness of the Aryan is not based on his intellectual powers, but rather on his willingness to devote all his faculties to the service of the community. National Socialism is a community where Aryans help each other. The Aryan lives for the state, and self-preservation gives way to the community and the greater race.
Very, very, very similar to fascism there. You can see why German National Socialism is considered part of the fascist movement, because that's basically the fascist doctrine as well.
The spirit underlying this attitude is expressed by the word work, which to him does not at all signify a means of earning one's daily livelihood, but rather a productive activity which cannot clash with the interests of the community. For the work which the individual performs is not the purpose of his existence, but only a means. His real purpose in life is to better himself and raise himself to a higher level as a human being, but this he can only do in and through the community whose cultural life he shares. National Socialism allows people to earn a living, but they're all working towards a higher cause, the race. And the community and the race and the state come first. Therefore,
Yeah, I guess the only difference with fascism is that fascism said nothing of race in its doctrine. It was about nation. But there's obviously an intersection between race and nation. And so it's very easy to see how one ideology can go hand in hand with the other.
for National Socialism is absolutely not capitalism. It's more like a beehive. Individuals and even businesses are working to produce honey for the leader so that the race as a whole may survive. They don't like foreigners, and there can only be one queen bee. And if you rebel or if your business doesn't fit the mould, the leader, the state, can get rid of you for the good of the greater Aryan hive. So let's talk about this Aryan business. Hitler says animals breed with their own species, crossbreeding is not allowed in the animal kingdom, and when it happens the offspring is sterile. Because the stronger must dominate the weak, there is a natural urge for there not to be any mixing of breeds. Therefore a superior race should not intermingle with an inferior one, and this is when he starts talking about the Jews. With the Jewish people, the readiness for sacrifice does not extend beyond the simple instinct of individual preservation.
Weird generalization, because you could say that same thing about many so-called Aryans. Like, you think that Aryans don't believe in that they aren't out for their own interests, for their own individual preservation. And also, one thing you can say about Jewish people historically is that they do have a lot of racial nepotism. Like, Jews will get other Jews into jobs that are really important and powerful and lucrative. And they'll prioritize the interests of other Jews over Gentiles. That's one of the reasons why there's so many successful Jews, is because they had that racial nepotism. So, I mean, that doesn't necessarily say much about self-sacrifice, but it does say that they have a sense of racial community about them, which is the trait that Hitler wanted to attribute to Aryans, but really, I think Jews have a better claim to that than Aryans do.
Jews act in concord only when a common danger threatens them or a common prey attracts them. Where these two motives no longer exist, and the most brutal egotism appears, and these people who before had lived together in unity will turn into a swarm of rats that bitterly fight against each other, apparently. And he just goes on and on about the Jews. If the Jews were the only people in the world, they would be wallowing in filth and mire, and would exploit one another and try to exterminate one another in a bitter struggle. The irony of this statement being that Hitler would later go on to exploit and exterminate the Jews.
and I mean, I've seen Fiddler on the Roof. Those guys weren't all trying to kill each other and exploit each other, and they were just living in a town and just trying to get by. I don't think they're that bad. Now they have their own country. They have Israel, and they don't seem to be wallowing in filth and mire and exploiting one another and exterminating one another in Israel. Although they do seem to be doing that to the Arabs. So maybe it's the fact that the Arabs are there that's stopping them. Because he does say if they were the only people in the world. So as long as they have an enemy, they can, exploit the enemy. But that's what Hitler did. That's what Hitler did to them. So it's totally hypocritical.
Jews themselves, as well as other races. Yeah, the whole book is filled with this prejudice. So in Hitler's mind, the Jews don't work towards the Aryan German state because they don't care about the national community. In his eyes, they are vermin, and he goes on to call them parasites. Therefore,
yeah, and there's a nuance here. Obviously, Hitler was extreme about his thoughts on this topic. For what reason, I don't know. Why the fuck did he care so much? But then you look at someone like Oswald Mosley, who was not an anti-Semite in the Hitlerian sense. But the thing about him is that He had an animosity with many Jews, not all, but many, because they didn't like him, because they judged him for being a fascist. And so it kind of created this sort of like, this is never going to work between us. But one of the things he wrote about in his 100 questions about fascism was the fascist movement has no issue with Jews. What it has an issue with is Jews who put the Jewish nation over the British nation. That Jews, if they want to be British, should embrace Britishness and embrace the nation and serve the nation as Brits, while also being Jewish. You can be Jewish at the same time. But what he saw was that Jews seemed to be more interested in promoting Jewish interests at the expense of British interests. Now, what that means precisely, I'm not entirely clear on. But I guess it's vague enough that you can interpret it uncharitably or charitably. I don't exactly know what the correct interpretation is there. But that's definitely along the lines of what Hitler is saying here, except that Hitler is going extremely far with it. Like Hitler took that basic idea and then made it like 100 times more racist, basically. More anti-Semitic, that's the word I was looking for.
For they're bad for the Aryan hive and must be eliminated. At the beginning of the First World War, or even during the war, if 12 or 15,000 of these Jews who were corrupting the nation had been forced to submit to poison gas, just as hundreds of thousands of our best German workers from every social stratum and from every trade and calling had to face it in the field, then millions of sacrifices made at the front would not have been in vain. On the contrary, if 12,000 of these malefactors had been eliminated in proper time, probably the lives of 1 million decent men who would be of value to Germany in the future might have been saved. Hitler is saying that if they'd killed a bunch of Jews in the First World War, they would have saved many good, honest German lives, somehow. So you can see the logic going into the Second World War. He also says that the Jews invented communism, which they didn't. But the important point is he thinks they did. And this is the point where he tries to
It was the Aryans who invented communism.
His socialism.
That's the irony.
Their socialism. And he does this by race. If you're part of the Aryan race, you can be a citizen of the socialist state that he's going to create. The People's State will classify its population in 3 groups: citizens, subjects of the state, and aliens. The rights of citizenship shall be conferred on every young man whose health and character have been certified as good after having completed his period of military service. On the occasion of conferring a diploma of citizenship, the new citizen must take a solemn oath of loyalty to the national community and the state. The bees get the benefit of having the honey and the protection of the state, but only if they're bees of this state. Foreign bees and other parasites are not allowed. The racial Weltanschauung is fundamentally distinguished from the Marxists by reason of the fact that the former recognises the significance of race and therefore also personal worth, and has made these the pillars of its structure. This is it. Hitler has spelt it out. What differentiates National Socialism from other Marxisms is race. It is socialism, but only for the Aryan. If the National Socialist movement should fail to understand the fundamental importance of this essential principle, if it should merely varnish the external appearance of the present state and adopt the majority principle, it would really do nothing more than compete with Marxism on its own ground. For that reason, it would not have the right to call itself a Weltanschauung. If the social program of the movement consisted of eliminating personality and putting the multitude in its place, then National Socialism would be corrupted with the poison of Marxism, just as our national bourgeois parties are. The difference between Marxism and Nazism is the race. Individual Aryan bees working towards the hive. Not all are equal in this type of bee socialism. There are individual bees who are better than others, but they do have an equal chance to climb the ladder. And individual bees do have rights and businesses, but the state can interfere in those rights and dictate what your businesses can and can't do for the benefit of the great Aryan bee. Yeah, this really is a socialist state, but access to this state is based on race.
Important to realize is that private property was preserved under this system. So I would say that this is a socialist idea, but it wouldn't be... It's not full socialism. It's not full democratization, like seizure of the means of production. That's not what it was. It was still very hierarchical. You know, he said at the beginning of the video that there's national welfare and then there's equality, and that Hitler was trying to push toward equality. But so far, I'm not really seeing that. To me, it just seems like welfare was the goal. It was like a very soft kind of welfare socialism rather than like full-on equality socialism, full-on seize the means of production socialism. So I don't know if I agree with this guy's premise so far, but let's see if he explains it more.
It's not class. The Marxist classless society ideal was redefined as a national community, but really these were the same thing. Hitler's broadest vision was that of the Volksgemeinschaft, the national community to be ruled by an elite blood.
But were they the same thing? Because the Volksgemeinschaft that he's talking about here had inequality and it had hierarchy. Whereas in the Marxist vision, you would have, well, particularly in the Marxist-Leninist vision, you would have a vanguard party that led a revolution and created a dictatorship of the proletariat. But then below them, it would all be equal. It was a community of producers. There wouldn't be any capitalists. But under Hitler's system, there was still capitalists. There were still capital owners who made profit off of other people's work. So I don't see these as being the same thing.
Order that to him would transcend the need for class barriers, which he saw as artificial and which stifled real creative talent. Mein Kampf goes on to say a lot more than this, but the point has been rammed enough. Hitler's creation was a merger of two seductive ideologies.
He said they would
stifled real creative talent.
Transcend the need for class barriers, which he saw are artificial and stifled real creative talent. What exactly does that mean? Transcend the need for class barriers. Because it doesn't, like, I don't know a whole lot about Hitler, but I do know that he was not a full-on socialist. He did not believe in, like, breaking down the system of capital and laborer.
Talent. Mein Kampf goes on to say a lot more than this, but the point has been rammed home enough. Hitler's creation was a merger of two seductive ideologies, international socialism and nationalistic pride. Fusing both of these two together, Hitler didn't need to nationalize the industries. Why do we need all that socialisation of the banks and factories? What does it matter once I have the people firmly fitted into a discipline form which they cannot escape?
Yeah, so he's admitting right here, he's talking to Strasser, who was an actual National Socialist, an actual communist who believed in the bigoted ideas of National Socialism. And he's straight up admitting here that he doesn't want socialism. He's saying, why do we need to nationalize the banks and factories? Now, there are other ways to achieve socialism than just nationalizing stuff. But when you're talking about the zeitgeist of the time and what socialism meant at the time, nationalism was nationalization, or socialization rather, was a huge part of it. And so he's saying we don't need the actual socialism in socialism to have socialism. Basically. It's kind of a Sorelian idea, I think. Because Sorel kind of abandoned the socialism part of socialism, but kept the kind of the mental, psychological aspect of the fighting syndicate. And that's basically what Hitler is saying here. If we can discipline people into thinking of themselves as worker bees, as in this guy's analogy, then we won't need actual socialism, because they'll be able to work with each other as good socialists under what is de facto de facto a capitalist economy. What is essentially a capitalist economy, and the benefit of that, therefore, would that we would be preserving the strengths of capitalism, which is like competition and whatnot. Which, from what I understand, Hitler was a fan of. He was proud of.
We are socializing the people. So do not think that the German Nazi state in the 1930s and 40s is capitalism. It really isn't capitalism. It's a state-controlled economy. For the Nazis...
it's a state-controlled capitalist economy. That's... yeah. It's capitalism. Not all capitalism is free market liberalism. You know, there's different kinds of capitalism and different kinds of socialism. And I'm not even saying it's not socialism. I think you can actually have an economy that is simultaneously capitalist and socialist. China is a good example of that. I don't like these terms that are usually thought of as mutually exclusive opposites. When you really understand political philosophy, you see how you can't be that limiting in the way you categorize systems, because reality doesn't actually follow what's written on the page. Reality is a lot more complicated than that. So, in some senses, the German society and economy of the time was socialist. In other senses, it was capitalist. But I don't think that these are mutually exclusive terms, you know.
Socialism was state intervention in private business rather than state ownership of business. Employer and employee remained so long as they were part of the Aryan race. So, yes, these guys are communists, basically. Or at least more communists
than they are not.
Have realised. You may not have made this connection before now either, and I don't blame you. National Socialists also don't like communists. So it's natural to think that these two ideologies are not similar. But they are. The reason Hitler hates the communists is because he says communism was created by the Jews, his mortal enemy. But placing the Jewish element aside for a moment, I would argue that the reason Hitler drones on and on about how much he hates communism and how much that his party and their parties are not the same is because he needs to differentiate his socialism from their socialism. Having read the primary source, I get the impression that the ramblings he goes on about for the vast majority of the book are only there to make sure everyone is clear that he isn't a Marxist socialist, because there isn't much of a difference between what he's saying and what they are saying.
There's a huge fucking difference. What are you talking about? Like, I don't want to hate this guy because he is making some good points, but like, I wish he didn't package these good points in a bunch of other points that suck, you know? It's not capitalism, it's socialism because describes capitalism. Exactly. It's like, what the fuck are you talking about? I like this guy, I'll be honest. I like this guy's presentation. He's straight to the point. In a lot of ways, he's doing a good job with this video, but it's just... I just wish he did a better job, because a lot of these points are just amateur fucking bullshit. Like, a guy who's not familiar with political philosophy, and I don't claim to be some, like, I haven't gone to school for this. I haven't read all 3 volumes of fucking Capital. You know, I'm not some expert at this, but like I've at least thought about it. You know, I feel like this guy just, I don't know what his aim is here. I don't know what angle he's trying to, if this guy's like a right winger who's trying to distance, because that's usually what it is. Usually these kinds of people are right wingers who are trying to distance conservatism from Hitlerism. And there's plenty of ways you can do that legitimately. You don't need to make stuff up.
So he's trying to come up with a difference. In fact, his hatred of the Jews and the ideal of the Aryan race is actually the main difference between the two ideologies. Now, when you look at the Second World War, what you have to realise is that you have 2 socialist states fighting against each other. However, this is just their economic policy. Hitler's National Socialists are definitely nationalists, which is a right-wing idea. So really you've got a party or a state which is both left-wing and right-wing at the same.
Okay, fair enough. Like, good on him for making this point, because this is the point that I've just made. Yeah, good job at making this distinction that you can be left and right at the same time. That's actually something that not everybody gets. This guy has some libertarian vibes. He does kind of have libertarian vibes. I wouldn't be surprised if he were a libertarian or maybe a UKIP voter. I'm not sure. But yeah.
Time. How can this be? Well, this is why the traditional political spectrum doesn't make any sense, like in the World War II context. Why is Nazism...
It doesn't make sense in any context.
It doesn't make any sense either. And why is anarchism next to communism? Again, that doesn't make any sense. So let's get rid of it. Instead, let's look at each aspect as a separate spectrum. Economics and politics are basically not the same. I guess you could even have left and right within this as well. But all you need to know is that these 2 states are economically socialist and politically authoritarian.
I would put... Okay. I would not... Here's the thing. I would not put socialist in the center between communist and capitalist. I would actually rather put like... well, I guess welfare socialist I would put in the center. Like, when I think socialist, I think straight up, we're abandoning capitalism. No more capitalism. And that's definitely not what Germany was doing at the time. That's not what Hitler was doing. So I would put socialist a little bit more to the left. But I'm not familiar with the ins and outs of German political economy at the time, so I can't say at what point I would put Germany on this axis, this economic spectrum. I can't imagine I would put them way far at the right, like a lot of lefties would put them, because I think, especially given all the stuff that he talked about from Mein Kampf, it doesn't seem like they were regular neoliberals, you know. But with with communism, like, he puts it right next to Hitler. I would probably put it a little bit more far left, because they pretty much nationalized everything under Marxism-Leninism. And so, yeah, that's pretty left. So I don't know if I agree with this, trying to shove them together as if they're right next to each other on the spectrum. No. But I would agree that they're both on the totalitarian dictatorship end. That does make sense. That's one area where they have a lot in common.
A strong national Reich, which recognises and protects to the largest possible measure the rights of its citizens, both within and outside its frontiers, can allow freedom to reign at home without trembling for the safety of the state. On the other hand, a strong national government can intervene to a considerable degree in the liberties of the individual subject, as well as the liberties of the constituent states, without thereby weakening the ideal of the Reich. Bees give up their freedom for the greater hive. Definitely authoritarian. To contrast this to the USA at the time of World War II, the USA would be right economically and probably mostly left on the political spectrum. Since she's not a democracy, she is a republic.
I would not put the USA that far right at the time. That was actually one of the times when they were a little bit more left-wing, because Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal had just been put into effect, and so they actually were engaging in more welfare at the time than they had been before. If we're talking about 1920s America, then yeah, I would put them pretty far right. But even then, the progressive movement had made a lot of inroads in America by then. And so I couldn't even put them totally at the end of the spectrum there either. Probably the Gilded Age of the late 1800s would be at exactly that part he puts them. But yeah, by the 1940s, they really weren't that far right. They were a little bit more to the left than that.
Republic for which she stands. Britain in the 1940s will probably be classed as mostly socialist economically, due to state intervention in the economy for the war effort and the post-war social welfare state. But
what about the New Deal? The U.S. had the same thing. It didn't have the NHS thing, but it had Social Security. It had, Keynesian public works initiatives. It had strong union membership. Like, the U.S. and the U.K. were not that far off. What the hell is it? Like, does he really think? Oh my God! Does he really think that the U.K. was between? Because look, he has them equal distances between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Does he actually think that the U.K. was right between, right at the middle, the median point between the U.S. and the Soviet Union? This is a terrible infographic. It's so manipulative.
Also, where the USA is on the political spectrum due to the parliamentary system. And when you think of the Cold War, the same applies. Think of it in terms of democracy versus totalitarian governments, rather than capitalism versus socialism, since socialist governments also falls on the side of the USA. So yes, National Socialism is actually authoritarian socialism, which itself is not that much different to Stalinist socialism. In fact, is there much...
It's very different. Come on. It's extremely fucking different. And you, that quote from Hitler that you pulled. Let me bring up that quote again. Oh my God. This quote proves that they're entirely different from each other. Why do we need all that socialization of banks and factories? What does it matter once I have the people firmly fitted into a discipline from which they cannot escape? We are socializing the people. Hitler to Strasser, 1930. He was talking to someone, if if you were making this video about Strasser and saying that Strasser's National Socialism wasn't that different from the Bolsheviks, then you would be totally right. But Hitler was clearly telling Strasser, I am not one of you. I am not like you. I am not a communist. And he explained it perfectly right here. Were you not paying attention to the quote that you pulled?
Itself is not that much different to Stalinist socialism. In fact, is there much of a difference between these two states? This is an ongoing historical debate. Just how similar are these two ideologies? And I'm not going to get into that debate here, but it's safe to say that in terms of their philosophies, their political influences, as well as their economic policies, government and other aspects, National Socialism and Stalinism are very similar indeed. And
I might be remembering wrong, but wasn't National Socialism an offshoot of Prussian socialism, which called for class collaboration instead of welfare? Oh, it very well might have been. I don't know that aspect of the history. But yeah, it very well might have been. I mean, Prussian socialism, I don't even really know what that is. I know about Bismarck and his like healthcare plan. Was he part of that whole phenomenon? Because I would consider that Bismarck, for his part, to be something of a socialist, even though he wasn't a Marxist in the slightest. But he socialized healthcare, he socialized medicine, which is a huge step at the time. But like it also draws so much from Italian fascism. Because Italian fascism was very similar, class collaboration. So, I mean, it might have been both sources that inspired Hitler and the other people in his movement.
And in terms of World War II, what we need to realise is that this was a war between two giant authoritarian power blocks. It is a war between different dictators. It is a war of ideologies. It is a racial war. It is a war of annihilation. But it's all...
The cork in my bottle broke off, and so I had to shove the rest of the cork down in there so I could get the rest of the liquid. I'm not an expert on it, but I remember reading that somewhere a while ago. It's probably true.
Also a war to see which version of socialism is the better version of socialism. And this is a central part of the war. So basically, to sum up, when you think of National Socialism, think racist communists, and you won't be far off.
No, that's Strasserism.
Patrons for your...
Does he not even know about the whole conflict between Hitler and Strasser? That's a huge part of NSDAP history. Does he not even know about the Night of the Long Knives? Like, this video is disappointing, man, because I really think that this guy is cool and he could like do good work, and I like aspects of this video, but man, it just sucks because at the end of it, I'm just left thinking, just bad thesis, not good. And I don't want to. I want to like this guy. I want to be on his side. Here's a preview of the next stuff I have on the playlist. So he has a please read comment. So I'm going to hear him out and hear what he has to say here. I love how he says racist communists as if communists of the time weren't also racist, LMAO. See, that's something you could tell me about because I don't know much about that. I mean, I know that Stalin had some anti-Semitic points. He wasn't entirely a good guy in that realm, but yeah, I don't know a whole lot about the racism in communism. But let's read what he has to say. I've replaced my original pinned comments in both videos because people either ignored them completely. Pinned comments is where I list my sources, not the description, as many of you claimed. So he says, first of all, the National Socialist economy and society in Germany was absolutely not capitalist, no matter how much people scream at me that it is. After crushing imports and exports in 1933 to 1934 in order to promote autarky and rearmament, party officials were basically in every shop and business, providing them with goods or foreign currency and dictating policy, etc. On top of this, autarky crushed imports and exports, causing the end of trade, helping to isolate Germany from the globalized economy. All of this caused a massive economic crisis in 1934, but to quote Too's wages of destruction, in practice the Reichsbank and the Reich Ministry of Economic Affairs had no intention of allowing the radical activists of the SA, the shop floor militants of the Nazi Party, or Gauleiter commissioners to dictate the course of events. Under the slogan of the strong state, the ministerial bureaucracy fashioned a new national structure of economic regulation. It would be absurd to deny the reality of this shift. The crisis of corporate capitalism in the course of the Great Depression did permanently alter the balance of power. Never again was big business to influence the course of government in Germany as directly as it did between the outbreak of World War I in 1914 and the onset of the Depression in 1929. The Reich's economic administration, for its part, accumulated unprecedented powers of national economic control. And this was 1934, so it was obviously not capitalism. And if it's heavy state intervention with a planned centralized economy without being capitalism, what could it be? But we still have private property, so it is capitalism. Like, you're just wrong. Like, it is, if there's private property, if there's private capital, then it is capitalism. That's what capitalism is, okay? Jesus Christ. A commenter critical of what I was saying, Adrian Mann, said that my definition of socialism was wrong and that it's about power relationships and shifting these to the workers. Okay, I absolutely agree with what he's saying here. From an ideological perspective of what was defined by Marx, that's a fair assessment. And I don't disagree. I've never done. But there's an issue with this definition historically, and people have given other definitions, revolutionary versus non-revolutionary, seizing the means of production, etc. In fact, socialism doesn't have one definition because, as Evans... Well then, if socialism doesn't have one definition, then why are you being so restrictive about your definition of capitalism? Oh, it has to be businesses controlling their own interests without the intervention of the government. Why? Why does it have to be that? It doesn't. If there is private capital, then that is capitalism. As Evans wrote, when an intellectual historian reads Hobbes' Leviathan or Marx's Das Kapital, it is not in order to use their writings to reconstruct something outside them, but in order to construct an interpretation of what they mean or meant. There are indeed many interpretations of these thinkers' ideas, not least because the systems of thought Hobbes and Marx established were so wide-ranging that they never became completely closed. So let's not pretend that socialism is a fixed definition. I'm not pretending it is. Now, some of you also have this concern. We are seeing a rise of fascism. To revise the meaning of socialism plays to a particular audience that I'm hoping you don't want, Adrian Mann. Okay, yeah, that's a bullshit criticism. We can probably skip his response to that. So you can see why he hated Bolshevism so much. He thought that international communism would allow the Jews to destroy the Aryan races. He therefore decided to take action and beat the Jews before they beat the Aryans. That's why he wanted to go east. Yeah, but you're forgetting the other part, which is that he hated their economic policy, which is why he killed Gregor Strasser. Like, did you forget that part? Oh my god. Like, Hitler wasn't some, like, fan of Soviet economics. He disagreed with communism. He disagreed with Marxism-Leninism straight up. Okay, this one's more interesting. Hitler thought that socialism was about power relationships too. The difference was that he thought the way to solve the issue wasn't by having the workers rise up, but actually by removing the Jews. I know this isn't socialism as Marx defined it, but stick with me for a bit longer. If you remove the Jews, then the power relationships wouldn't happen. The Aryan race would all work together as a collective to better the German nation. The elites would help their fellow men, and the workers could rise to the top. Hitler does say that the latter still exists, because individuals should be able to climb up if they're better than others. That would actually help the race, because supposedly the better elements of the race would rise upwards. And you do have quite a bit of social movement in the National Socialist era of Germany, so it's not completely correct to say he was just saying this stuff. So what you're saying is that Hitler believed in capitalism, but he also thought of it as socialism because he thought that the Jews were what created the problems inherent in capitalism. And if you get rid of the Jews, then capitalism becomes socialism because the Aryan race is just a naturally socialistic race. Yeah, you're not exactly convincing me with that line. I mean, yeah, there's a logic to it, but that logic does not lead to Hitler is basically Stalin. It doesn't lead there. Sorry. Yeah. All right. Well, I heard him out, and it was still bullshit. Holy wall of text, Batman. Has this guy listened to any of Hitler's speeches, LMFAO? I haven't listened to many of Hitler's speeches, but even I know this is bullshit. Like, I feel like if he didn't ignore the Strasser question, he would have figured this out. He would have figured out the nuance here. But he's just really trying hard to propagandize us into this. He just railroad us into this perspective that just lacks all nuance. And then he's trying to add all this nuance where it matters to him, but then he's not extending the same thing the other direction. It's just so dishonest. I'm just reading some of the other comments. Nazis were communists. 15 minutes later, Nazis did not seize ownership of private property, but instead allowed employer-employee relationships to remain so long as they were of the same race. Don't think you know what socialism or communism is, mate. Socialism doesn't just mean when a state does things. Yeah, pretty much. Let's see what he had to say to that. Private property plus markets plus state intervention in the economy equals socialism. It also equals capitalism, my friend. It also equals capitalism. Oh my fucking god. What an idiot. This guy sucks. I changed my mind, man. Because here's the thing, like, I don't like this guy anymore. I initially liked him. But the fact that he's not taking the criticism well makes me not like him. Like, if he just made mistakes, then fine, whatever. But he's just buckling down. He's he's like refusing to agree to anything that just makes perfect sense. Like any criticism that's just airtight, he's like, no. Yeah, I don't know. What a disappointment. It's called selective reading, like how Christians do with the Bible. Yeah. It's so selective. All right. Well, I think I'm going to clip this video for another upload because I think I got some good material out of this one. This one was a pretty good one.